Hi, I'm Sarah, and I am gonna jump in on Plastic Age on the thing to make sure I am live. You might be seeing a commercial right now. I don't know. um, Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Stewart, and I'm one of the co-authors of this lovely book, Vigilant, Through Shadows and Dreams, Book 1. It is a Scarred Lands novel. I'm kind of waiting for the ad to end. I'm going to repeat all that when the ad's over, because I don't know if you are seeing the ad that I'm seeing, so I'm just going to let that kick in. Okay, so as I was saying, co-author, lead author of Vigilant Through Shadows and Dreams, Book 1. It is a Scarred Lands novel. We're on Travis Legg's Twitch channel, Plastic Age Plays, to read a little bit of our book. Myself and my co-author and wife, Fran, just to kind of share it with you guys a little bit. So here we are. It's, kind of just a thing to do to celebrate the new year with everybody and more importantly, raise money for a belated World AIDS Day. We're at $240. We want to be at $250. Sorry, we're at $140, as Fran is correcting me in the background. She's the editor, and I'm tired. So, anyway, where was I? All right, I'm going to read a little bit of this book. We're going to kind of pick up a little bit in the middle, since the Gentleman Gamer, who's one of the Scarlands folks, has read the prologue and chapters 1 and 2 on his YouTube channel, so we're not going to reread that, but we'll kind of summarize it for you. But I'm just going to kick things off by reading the introduction to set the setting, set the stage, as it were. As I said, this is a Scarred Lands novel, which is the world that Travis Legg is the line lead of for Dungeons and Dragons. This is the map of the world, which you can also see in the background there on Twitch. And I guess here we go. Prologue. Our world is not what it once was. Skarn was beautiful and battered and was broken. What? I'm going to start that over because I can't even read today. Our world is not what it once was. Skarn was broken and battered in the great conflict that raged across its face for years. The Titans, primal beings, forces of nature that created and shaped Skarn, warred with their children, the gods. Mortal life is beneath the notice of a Titan. Even the gods were more curiosities to them than children, playthings, to be enjoyed or broken as the Titans' moods took them. It was the gods who discovered and harnessed the power of mortal faith, and who used that power to challenge their creators. And so they did battle, drowning the world in fire and blood. The Titans sank islands and cleaved whole continents asunder. Wherever they bled, monsters arose and spread their terror. The gods fought with mortal armies at their backs, spending cities' worth of lives for each Titan they defeated, but defeating them all. Today the Titans are fallen, gone for a century and a half. They could not be killed, but they could be ruined, broken, or imprisoned. The miserable Titan spawned, the monsters that pay them homage, could be scattered and slaughtered. And that is what we did, though at a terrible cost. The lands of Skarn are devastated and forever scarred. Nations and races have died, gods too, in places that sea itself runs with blood. And still, the Titans spawn mourn their masters and plot their return. All is chaos and uncertainty. But many things thrive on chaos. Heroes, villains, adventurers, legends. So come, let me show you a little of each. Come and see the wonder that is Skarn. That's the little intro. And I'm going to hand the book off to Fran, because honestly, she's just more awake than I am. So let her kind of show the next bit. Just a sec.
Okay. Well, I know. Okay. And you need to take your laptop. Yeah, if it wasn't already obvious, we're pros at this. So, at the point the Gentleman Gamer left off, we have learned that Iacade Lenar, who's the main character of our story, is basically a young farm boy from kind of a crummy country to the south who's decided that he wants to make his fortune and be a hero in the army of the great nation of Lave, which is one of the democratic bastions of Gelspad. Sarah's pointing to where he's from on the map. So he's traveled many hundreds of miles to get to Vesh and to enlist in the famous Vigilance there. And he's started his basic training at the camp at Bride Lake, which is where all Vigilants are trained. And he's started to make at least a few friends. We're going to pick up from around the point that the Gentleman Gamer left off with Chapter 3. Eacade took his bowl of stew, rind of cheese, and hunk of bread and looked around. He recognized only a few faces from the training yard, and all were engrossed in their own conversations. Then the woman who'd explained the marking enchantment earlier gestured to him to join her table. "I'm Amra Vareth," she said. "Eacade Lenar is my name," he replied, sounding out the Veshan phrase carefully. In Lydian, which is the language that's more common where he comes from originally, he replied, there we are. In Lydian, he continued, "Good to meet you." She smiled and spoke back in Lydian. "It seems she raised you out of rank 1 as fast as she did with me last week." The drill sergeant didn't realize quite how capable Eacade was, so Eacade nodded. "Yeah, it turns out I'm a lot older than she thought." Amra grinned. "I'm only 19, I just know what I'm doing. I used to train with a ranger, taught me everything already." "Oh? Okay, not everything, but well enough to get past rank 1 in swordsmanship." Eacade smiled at her cheekiness and listened as she rambled about how she'd come to join the Vigil. She and a friend, Aranis, played orcs and Vigilance when they were kids. As soon as he was old enough, he went off to join the Vigilance, leaving her behind until she grew old enough to follow. As she spoke, she grew distant, absently tucking loose hair behind her ear where it had come undone from her long braid. "Now he's off fighting rats and hags," she said. Jax's laugh cut through the clatter of the hall. He pushed through the crowded room, several other recruits following. "This is Lenar," Jax said, dipping his head to Eacade. "These are your bunk and squad mates, Lenar. I'm pretty sure you had too much sleep in your eyes to note them this morning. Miller, Wainwright, Hutchling, and Gandy." Jax made a flurry of introductions, and then the whole group fell to their food to talk about the training, the meals, and various other topics. Eacade noted each name and face. Miller was the short, shy boy, Wainwright the girl who laughed at everything, Hutchling was the man with the Madriel symbol on his vest, and Gandy was the half-elven woman. But though he tried to pay attention to the conversation, over half was in Veshan, and the others made little allowance for his confusion and tiredness. "Hey," Amra interrupted, "Lenar here doesn't speak good Veshan. Keep it to Lydian." "No, it's okay," Eacade replied. "I'll never learn if everyone around me speaks Lydian all the time." "Well, you don't have to worry about that," said Jax. "Half the afternoon lectures are in Veshan. You'll pick it up fast enough." Eacade groaned. Amra patted his arm. "Don't worry, I'll teach you Veshan. We'll probably be in a lot of the same classes. We can share notes." Eacade smiled. "That's very kind, thank you." The first afternoon lecture was an introduction for the newest recruits. The room was full of benches and tables with inkwells and quills for writing. A bookshelf lined one wall full of books and scrolls. At the front of the room hung a large map of the continent of Gelspad, pretty similar to this one, actually. Most of the map was in black and white, except a wide red area on the right indicating the Blood Sea. Eacade sat next to Amra, who'd arrived too late the prior week to attend. 5 other recruits found their own places. Sir Van, who's a paladin who we met earlier in one of the earlier chapters, sat alone on a bench, seemingly eager for the lecture to start. A grizzled veteran entered the room and stood at the lectern. "I'm Captain Damien Wildson of the Beltanian Vigil," he said in Lydian. "You will call me Captain or Sir. Today, I'm going to teach you the Vigil Oaths and the basic history of the Veshan Vigil. First off, the Oaths." He pulled out sheets of parchment. "You will be given a copy of this, so you will not need to write them down. He started reciting without even glancing at the sheets, eyes piercing each recruit in turn as he spoke. 1. Obey the people of Vesh and their chosen leaders in all things. 2. Obey lawful commands as you would the people of Vesh. 3. Honor the goddesses Tanel and Madriel, and aid Corian the Avenger and his followers whenever possible. Honor and respect the followers of Denev, the Earth Mother, save when their actions prevent execution of lawful duties. 4. Defend the weak and avoid taking innocent life. 5. Oppose the Titan spawn and the enemies of Vesh in every way possible. The veteran's eyes reached Eacade in their sweep across the room. 6. You are a Vigilant for life. Eacade's pulse sped with excitement. He nodded. Wildson's gaze moved on. 7. Obey these oaths, for they are the heart and soul of the Vigils. He handed the stack to the nearest recruit. Pass these out, recruit. The young cleric got to her feet and went from desk to desk, handing out the carefully lettered, thick, durable parchment pages. Recruits, I expect you to memorize these. You will recite them every morning after your morning prayers and every night before you fall asleep. You will recite them while you eat, while you fight, while you shit, and while you fuck. 50 years from now, I want you to know these oaths better than the names of your closest family and loved ones. Someone snickered in the front row. The captain waggled his bushy eyebrows and stalked down the row of benches. He stopped when his shadow fell on a young ranger, still a teen, with flaming hair and pale, freckled skin that rapidly grew paler. Recruit, did you find something amusing? No, sir, the boy squeaked. I didn't know we could fuck, sir. A quiet wave of snickers drifted through the room. The captain curdled the boy with his eyes for a long second. What you do in your own time, what little you'll have of it, is your own business. That said, he continued, turning to the rest of the room, there are rules about this. Sexual relations require consent among all parties involved. Coercion means discharge with disgrace. That means no intercourse with an inferior rank. That's coercion, which makes it forbidden. Amra shifted in her place. When Eacade glanced, concern and frustration had sketched lines on her face, which she struggled to conceal. The captain continued, and I don't want anyone catching the pox or getting pregnant, so be sure to see a cleric or herbalist for proper protection before you so much as hold hands. In the next part of his lecture, the captain described the various vigils, their locations, responsibilities, and posts. The names and places organized themselves in Eacade's memory without much passion, until the Arsenoth Delta Vigil. The Delta is part of the Morning Marshes, the captain said. He pointed to the edge of the bloodstain on the map, just below the Veshan border. The Vigilants in Arsenoth keep our southeast border from being overrun by hordes of Slytherin rat spawn. The rats have invaded time and time again, but they always break against the strength of Arsenoth Delta Vigil. Once Wildson finished his lecture, Amra raised her hand. Sir, can recruits choose which vigil they join? It's considered. Vigilants should go to vigils that best match their skills. Those with a knack for sailing, for example, go to the Maritime Vigil. But we must also balance our forces. Less popular vigils like Pelpernoy and dangerous ones like Arsenoth Delta get reinforced after they take heavy losses. However, we typically assign more experienced vigilants to those posts, while new recruits go to vigils that get less action to get experience in the field before serving in a more dangerous post. Is Arsenoth Delta particularly dangerous? Amra asked. The captain tilted his head. Certainly. Maybe not the most dangerous post. That would probably be the Lulharden. They're right in the heart of the plains of Lead with the Orcs, the Proud, and Vangel's horsemen. The Marsh Vigil comes in a close second. It sits in the middle of a stinking swamp full of mud, disease, insects, and filth. Churn's very arsehole. Once you've served in the Marsh Vigil, you'll never feel clean and dry again. Surely it can't be that bad. Oh, it is. I served there for a year. A year was enough. He looked at his hands, as though he might still find mud under his fingernails. Nearly a fifth of the Beltanians served sometime in the southern marshes. You learn fast there, but most just see out their year and transfer. Those who stay are some of the toughest, strongest, most stubborn vigilants there are, and Marshal Silverblade is one of the best. I'd gladly serve with him again if it wasn't for all the mud. He'd even give Kelmus Durin a run for his money. if he should run for the office of Home Commander, but he'll never leave the marshes. At least, not until all the hags are exterminated and the Slytherin come to heel. Eacade was too excited about the Slytherin to be concerned about the mud. He was determined to be chosen for Arsinoth. I'll need to work extra hard if they don't normally send new recruits, but that's my vigil. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of lessons, bouncing from skill to skill. Geography, starting a fire in the rain without using magic, and packing properly for a 10-day march. Amra took notes during geography class and reviewed them with Eacade over dinner. Their books, maps, and parchment took over half the table, so the other recruits left them alone. After explaining her notes, she rested her head in her cupped hands and scrutinized Eacade. "So, where exactly are you from, foreigner?" Eacade sighed. "I can't avoid this forever." She smiled. "It's okay, you know. You're not the only recruit from outside Vesh. Servan's from Mithril, Miller's from Hadrad. It's just unusual for foreigners to join the Veshan Vigil." "Well, Servan's not technically a recruit, and I'm not sure he's originally from Mithril." Whatever. My point is that it's about what's in your heart, not about where you're from. If your heart is Veshan, is devoted to the Veshan way of life, that's all that matters. Eacade nodded. "Yeah, that makes sense, I guess. My mother's talked about the Vigilance for as long as I can remember, and it's always been my dream. Her father was a Veshan Vigilant. Somebody important, maybe. I think that's why Kelmister let me join." "Wait, you've met the Home Commander?" "Yeah, he interviewed me when I signed up." "Oh, that's exciting. What's he like?" Eacade scratched his head. Important, intimidating, but warm, kind of like a..." Eacade paused, his father's face appearing in his mind and a pang of loss in his heart. He blinked the image away. "Like an uncle." Amra grinned. "Anyway, you still haven't answered my question. Where are you from?" Eacade took a deep breath and exhaled. "New Veneer?" She squinted, confused. "Where is that?" Eacade shook his head. "North of Galita's Grove. You've never heard of it?" She dug out the map of Eastern Gelspad from their geography work. "Where on the map?" "Here," he said, pointing to the southern border of the Blood Steppes. "Whoa, that must be 600 miles from here." "Well, give or take. My family lives about 30 miles northeast of Deriz," he said, finding the city on the map and pointing. "It's on the River Eni." "So you've traveled a lot. You might not need much help in geography." Eacade shrugged. "I just traveled from there to here with traders, up the Eni River, across Mountain Tier Loch. I think it's called Denev's Aquifer on this map, and then across Vesh to Lave, and finally on horseback to here." She followed his journey on the map, eyes widening. He continued, "Beyond that, I basically just know the Eni River area and the very southeast corner of the Blood Steppes, but only up until about the edge of the South Fang region. It's insanely dangerous, though there's good hunting if you know how to avoid the Titan spawn." "What's in South Fang?" "Fire Rack Dragon?" Her jaw dropped. "You've seen a dragon?" Eacade shook his head. "No, just its minions, Slytherin." "So you fought Slytherin?" He shrugged again. "Not alone. Sometimes our hunting groups would encounter one of theirs, but we made sure to hunt in large numbers, especially after my father was killed." His look darkened. "His death taught us a lesson, and no one in the village hunts alone since then. Slytherin never bother a large group." She looked more closely at the map. "You know, they'll probably want you for Pelpernoy Vigil if you know the area near the Haggard Hills." Eacade shook his head. "No, I'm doing everything I can to get into Arsinoth Delta." She nodded. "Me too." And this is a chapter boundary, so I'm going to offer my wife a chance to swap in if she wants.
Can't just read for too long, right? You didn't shut the door behind me. Everybody's gonna see my messy living room. Okay, moving on. The next 12 days for Eacade went by fast, crammed with activity for him to put in his letters home. Sword work came naturally to him with the smaller, faster blades. Previously in a chapter we showed how he learned how to use a short sword instead of a big sword. He quickly earned the right to carry a short sword beside his knife. He also improved in archery, although his father's longbow was still more than he could manage. His father's got this massive, Oedipician longbow. Oedipus, right? No, not Oedipus. Doesn't matter. Amra's pleasant company polished his Veshan language skills, and he applied his own patience to focus her on important details that otherwise slipped past her. But still, he spent every free moment on study or practice. Only the toughest go to Arsenoth Delta. Arberneith's special training 3 days a week turned out not to be in scouting or magic. She assigned the whole platoon to wilderness stamina drills. After a shortened morning weapon practice, the recruits in his platoon were each given massive packs of gear to carry. They left Bride Lake and marched for miles into the countryside. In the early evening they took a break and set up camp using the gear they carried. They ate cold rations while Arberneith inspected their work. Then they fixed any mistakes she found, and then immediately tore down the camp and hiked all the way back to the fortress. After returning the packs to the quartermaster, they went straight to bed. Eacade ached through weapon practice the next morning, and could see from watching the rest of his and Amra's squads that he was not alone. They repeated the drill again every few days, each time getting a little further and a little faster. As they slogged home on a particularly damp and chilly night, Eacade reflected that while the exhausting marches took toll on discipline, they built the squad's camaraderie. Jax was, after Amra, Eacade's closest friend. Not only were their fighting styles similar, but they had the same quiet sense of humor. Gandhi, their squad leader, was an outspoken half-elf, her wit nearly as sharp as her sword, and Eacade had quickly come to trust her judgment. Hutchling was a cleric of Madriel, highly intuitive about people, and as vicious a fighter as he was gentle as a healer. Miller was a naive young man originally from Hadrad, and had only moved to Vesh a few years before. And chatty Wainwright came from a long line of carters and fully expected to join the Mullis town vigil after her training. "Hey, Jax," Gandhi panted as she scrambled up an earthen bank. "Did you know that our fourth oath is to defend the weak and protect innocents?" "As it happens," he said, hauling Hutchling up the slope, "I did. Did you know that we're supposed to oppose the enemies of Vesh, even while carrying these goddamned packs?" Wainwright snickered. Miller grumbled. Fifth oath," grunted Hutchling. Eacade put his shoulder to Hutchling's pack and heaved. "Did you guys know that we get to fuck?" A paroxysm of laughter seized Hutchling and Jax, and they toppled and rolled down the bank and into the creek below. Even Miller snickered. Then, in unison, Gandhi said, and Wainwright shouted, "But first you have to see the blasted cleric!" Finally, the spring holiday arrived, the second wild day of Tanat, the second month of spring. It was Eacade's first day off since he'd arrived on the last day of Korat, the previous month. Even the usual morning drum revel felt almost festive. The day was filled with athletic competitions like the ones Eacade remembered from the holidays at home: archery, wrestling, weightlifting, stick fighting, and various contests of balance and stamina. About the only contest missing from home was the tug-of-war, which Eacade never really liked much anyway. He joined in the archery and balance games and took second place on the log roll. Sergeant Arberneith and many other followers of Tannel the Huntress left on a hunt in the early morning and returned in the afternoon with meat for the evening feast. The courtyard and dining halls were decorated with colored lanterns and flower chains. The smell of grilled venison and boar filled the night air, mixed with the scent of flowers. Musicians began to play, and barrels of ale were rolled out from storage. In the center of the courtyard, Eacade sat with his squadmates, slurping from mugs of ale. They rested their sore muscles and watched as townsfolk from Bride Lake laid tables for the evening feast. Is this celebration anything like where you come from, Lenore? Asked Jax. Yeah, a lot, actually, Iacade replied, although I won't know for sure until after the feast. Why? What happens after the feast? Iacade took a sip of ale, contemplating his drink for a moment, and then quietly replied, an orgy, usually. Several of his squad mates gasped, and Jax and Miller spit their drinks out in surprise. After he stopped coughing, Miller stared at Iacade. Iacade smirked. I am Venerian. Aren't we all known for that sort of thing? Miller paled. You? Really? Iacade shook his head. I mean, for sure they happen in the capital. Small villages like mine aren't exactly known for orgies. I've had a wild night or two, but nothing quite that broadly attended. His squadmates laughed and joked, enjoying their ales as a cart loaded with thick planks rolled up. I wish things around here were had a little more broad attendance, Gandhi lamented. Iacade looked over to where she was gazing and saw Sir Van was across the courtyard, heaving a great slab of wood onto his shoulders. He had won the wrestling competition earlier in the day and was still wearing only his breeches. Hutchling laughed. I hate to break it to you, Gandhi, but he'd be more interested in me than in you. Gandhi looked at Hutchling, confused. But you're both... Oh! She peered at the blond man. Are you sure? Hutchling nodded wistfully, watching Sir Van. Across the courtyard, the half-orc laid the sturdy planks edge to edge on the edge in front of the musician's stand to form the first section of a dance floor. His back muscles gleamed and stood out sharply in the slanting sunset light. Oh, I'm sure, Hutchling said, and I'd happily accept his attention if he was available, but he's clearly already taken. No, Wainwright whispered. Who? Hutchling laughed, his eyes sparkling conspiratorially. Have you ever seen him look at Lieutenant Shazar of the Bajoran Vigil? He goes all dream-eyed and follows him around like a lost puppy. And the lieutenant, well, it's definitely reciprocated. I've never seen anyone run their fingers through an orc's hair like that before, and Sir Van really seemed to be enjoying it. Gandhi hid her face in her hands. Wainwright giggled. That's so charming, she murmured. Iacade glanced curiously at Jax, who shrugged and shook his head. I've got no reason to doubt Hutchling on this, he'd know. Miller sputtered. That's illegal in Hadrad. You'd be executed. Wainwright and Jax fell silent. Hutchling paled. Remind me never to go to Hadrad. Iacade exhaled sharply. That's certainly harsher than any law in New Veneer. Hell, that's harsher than in Calastia. And slavery is legal there. I've never heard of any place where it's illegal for men to love other men, never mind treating it like a major crime. That sounds unreal. Miller shook his head. Oh, it's very real. You can be fined for just smiling in Hadrad. Sodomy gets you the same punishment as murdering a priest. And they're our allies? Gandhi muttered. There's worse punishments than death, though, Miller continued. There's a reason my family left the city. The whole squad shivered at whatever might be worse than death. And on that cheery note, said Jax, let's get some more ale. After the feast, Wainwright dragged Iacade out onto the dance floor. She was pleasant enough, but he kept his eye out for Amra. When her squad finally arrived, Wainwright just laughed and rolled her eyes. Go off with your sweetheart. She's not my sweetheart. Whatever, go. I'll dance with Hutchling. He may prefer men, but he's nearly as graceful on the dance floor as you. Iacade's face grew hot at the compliment. Wainwright went off in search of Hutchling. Iacade made his way across the crowd to where Amra was chatting with her squadmates. He greeted the group and then made a deep and formal bow to Amra. He held out his hand and said in his best courtly Veshian, Would my lady care to dance? Amra laughed. Seriously, Lenore? I did not teach you that line. Iacade stood up and smoothly replied, I did know some Veshian before working with you. Or would you prefer I speak in Shalzari? Or Calastian? Amra looked surprised. Wait, you speak Shalzari? And Calastian? Iacade blushed. A little Calastian. About as well as I now speak Veshian. It came from a trading town. We heard lots of languages. Amro took his hand, leading him to the dance floor. Well, aren't you just full of surprises? Let me know if you're a if you're a polyglot, they'll want you for Samanye Vigil. They say it's full of spies. They need people who understand Calastian. Iekade shook his head. Arshanoth Delta. Amr grinned. Of course. And in unison, they both said, Me too. After 3 dances, Amra stopped and pulled Iekade back off the dance floor. Once they were far enough away from the music and revelry to hear each other speak, she said, We have to head back to the barracks soon. Iekade frowned in disappointment. Tomorrow's Char Day, and that means another day-long hike for our platoon, she told him. I need some sleep. Seriously? After tonight, we have to hike? That's torture. She shrugged. That's training for you. Have to make us tough. Iekade sighed. No broad attendance for me tonight, then. Amra laughed. What? Iekade shook his head. Nothing, just a joke with my squad. Sleep well. You too. After Amr left, Iekade tracked down his squad mates. Is it true that we've got another hike tomorrow? His squad looked daggers at Gandhi. Hey, I'm just our squad corporal, she protested. I don't decide what the platoon does. You gotta convince Sergeant Arberneath. She's platoon leader, and her orders come from the captain. He's probably the one who decides when things happen. Hutchling squinted. Arberneath just spent all day hunting. Do you really think she'll want to spend tomorrow hiking? Jack sighed. Gandhi's right. She's 100-whatever-year-old wood elf. She can hike 50 miles a day for a solid month. Do you really think 2 days in a row in the woods would faze her? The whole squad groaned. They finished their ales. Hutchling and Wainwright danced one last dance, and the group of them headed back to their bunkhouse. Okay, now flipping back to Fran for chapter 5. Ding, 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 ding.
I hope y'all are enjoying this. I know for some folks this is the East Coast, so we're reading you a terrifying bedtime story. Okay, chapter 5. Much to their surprise, the next day was a little different. They shrugged into their heavy packs for a hike after morning weapon training, but this time the sergeant called the halt only a mile or 2 into the woods. After they'd made camp, she assembled the platoon. Today, Arberneath announced, we begin exercises in wilderness stealth. You'll split into 2 groups, 2 squads in each group. The first 2 squads will have 5 minutes to hide in the forest within the boundaries that we've marked off. You must also help your squad mates hide, as I suspect some of you will be better at this than others. After 5 minutes, we'll sound the horn, and the second group will have 20 minutes to find and tag each person from the first. Once you've been caught, come back here. At the end of the 20 minutes, we'll sound the horn again. Return here to tally up your squad scores, and the teams will switch roles. Amra called out, So we're playing hide and seek? Arberneath nodded. Something like that. Iekade's squad was in the first group to hide. As they jogged through the brush, Gandhi and Jax shushed Wainwright, who tended to chatter. Hutchling loudly snapped every twig he came upon. Oh, Fingal's hairy bottom, he snarled. Iekade tapped him and pointed out a tree with a thick, leafy canopy and plenty of branches. No one ever thinks to look up, he whispered. Hutchling nodded, and they helped the cleric heave himself up the tree. Okay, split up, Iekade suggested. Make them find us one at a time. The 4 remaining rangers sprinted off in different directions. Iekade spotted a small ravine and considered it. Too obvious, but... He glanced around and saw a deep rut in a tree trunk, covered with green moss. Laying down in the rut, he ducked under his green cloak just as the horn sounded. His heart thumped loudly. Quiet footfalls stirred the leaves. He held his breath until they faded. A few minutes later, a second person approached. He heard a boot scrape the stones of the ravine, but the horn sounded. He waited until the searcher headed back before getting into his feet with a smile. Half his squad had been found, but Hutchling grinned gleefully. You were right, Hutchling whispered. No one ever looked up. Sir Van stood right under my tree for ages. Next round, we should all climb trees. Iacade shook his head. As soon as they find one of us, they'll catch on. We have to mix things up. As seekers, Miller and Hutchling impressed Iacade with their ability to notice the smallest thing out of place. Of the opposing squads, only Amra evaded capture. The next round, Arbeneath broke them into pairs. Hide with your partner. If one's caught, both lose, she said, and paired Jax with Hutchling, Gandy with Miller, and Iacade with Wainwright. How romantic, Hutchling quipped as he looked over at the pair and gave Jax a wink. Oh, get over yourself, Hutch, Jax replied. And Miller, don't you go getting fresh with your commander either. Miller turned berry red. The starting horn sounded. Gandy glared at her squadmates. Remember what you've learned, she growled. Then she dragged Miller away into the woods. Iacade brought Wainwright to the cleft in the tree trunk. Nice, she exclaimed loudly. He glared at her and she quickly clapped her hands over her mouth. They crouched down, the crevice barely deep enough for the two of them. We can't see if anyone is coming, she whispered. He put his mouth against her ear. It doesn't matter if they can't see us either. Now quiet. She nodded. The horn sounded. Padding footsteps crossed the clearing. Iacade cupped his hand to his ear, but the sounds were too faint to follow. Wainwright wrinkled her nose. She sniffed. He grabbed her shoulder. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to cover her mouth. Her powerful sneeze rattled the leaves around them. Gotcha! Whooped Amra as she yanked Iacade's cloak back. Iacade wrenched his hand self-consciously away from Wainwright and immediately felt foolish for doing so. Why'd you do that? Amra's a friend. Stop acting like she's more. Amra didn't seem to notice and just laughed as she helped Wainwright to her feet. Iacade scrambled after them. You need a lot more practice if you want to earn a medallion, Amra told Wainwright. I hope you get paired with a clumsy paladin, Wainwright muttered in return. Each round, Arbeneath set a harder challenge, but each squad rose to match it. One squad gave up hiding and simply outran their pursuers. Another round, Iacade used mud to camouflage himself and his squad. By the evening, the platoon was exhausted but cheerful, covered in mud, twigs, and sweat. Arbeneath, while not effusive in her praise, was more generous than usual. Around the campfire, the sergeant described the elven ways of woodland stealth. I'm pleased with how many of these techniques you applied on your own. She also congratulated Iacade and Amra as the two stealthiest rangers in the platoon. You'd both be excellent choices for the Ganges Vigil. Iacade shook his head and said, Arsenath, Delta, Amra finished. Arbeneath raised her eyebrow in surprise. Interesting. I'll make a note of that. As she turned away, Iacade and Amra shared a determined grin. After her lecture, the recruits sat around the fire, chatting over the highlights of the day. You're natural at this, Lennar, Jax said. At hiding, maybe, quipped Sir Van, not so much at seeking. He circled me for a good minute and didn't spot me. You're green, Iacade grumbled, like a giant tree frog. The others chuckled. Sir Van gestured at his mud-covered chest and said, With this mud all over me, I'm surprised you couldn't smell me. The laughter was infectious, and Iacade's belly ached from it. Gandy poked him in the arm. I heard what the sergeant said to you. You and Vareth really wanted an Arsenath Delta? Amra and Iacade both nodded. Well then, I hope you enjoyed being covered in mud today. Chapter 6. Dear Iacade, we're so thrilled to receive your letters, so proud of you. Know you'll be a wonderful Vigilant. Your training sounds very hard. Don't overdo it. Marching so many miles in one day sounds very unreasonable. I know you'll master your father's bow soon. The carnival was boisterous this year. Young Gladys danced with Cain all night. Would make a good wife for him, but is much too forward. The flowers are blooming and butterflies fill the garden, filled the feeder, so many birds. Woodpeckers and cardinals, vivid, others puffed up against the wind. Wonderful to watch. Eat well. Is the food terrible? Bland? Wish I could send treats, but they'd never survive the trip. Took 2 months for your letters to get here. Love, Mother. Eo, Gladys won't leave me alone. How do you deal with girls? Don't get killed. Signed, Cain. And I'm going to hand off to Sarah again.
The cord is all tangled up here. Okay. Oof. And I'm sitting on it. Okay, here we go. This swap thing is a little awkward. Okay. Where were we? Oh, right. Chapter 6. So Fran just finished what I called the letters chapter. The one thing I would change in this book, if we ever get a second edition, I have no idea if we'll get a second edition, other than all the typos, which there are not a lot, but still an embarrassing number, I would change Kane's letter. There's little, Gladys won't leave me alone, how do you deal with girls? Don't get killed. It was just too brief. I think Kane would write a lot more than that, and he'd be more introspective, but it was a joke. So there you go. Hey, we're up to 100 no, we were up to 140 before. Come on, people, donate. Okay. Donate, good cause. Chapter 7. Hard work made the weeks go by quickly, and Iekade barely had time to write the occasional letter home. They learned endurance by swimming in the icy water of the lake. They experienced the beguilement of illusion, spells, and magic meant to frighten soldiers off the battlefield. They trained in mental tricks to help them keep secrets even when tortured. Their training shifted from working as a squad to individual roles within the Vigilance. Hutchling studied with the senior clerics, honing his healing skills and divine magic. Wainwright showed a flair for mounted combat. Miller trained in scribe work, sums, and figures. Gandy and Jax focused on their archery. Arborneath taxed Jax to become a scout, and Iekade had hoped to join him. But despite his prowess in close quarters fighting and stealth, despite his hours of library study, he had no natural eye for tracking and observation. Jax and his fellow scouts saw things Iekade simply did not. Instead, he joined Amra and trained as a stalker. The Vigilants sent in their stalkers when numbers alone wouldn't win a battle. He learned to cross enemy lines, to terrorize them in their camps, killing guards, distracting patrols, sabotaging equipment, and paving the way for a larger Vigilant force. Iekade and Amra also learned other skills particularly useful for the Marsh Vigil, wetland survival, swamp combat, and everything they could read about the Slytherin. Through all of it, friendship encouraged Iekade to succeed, the support of his squadmates who cheered him on, and his shared dedication with Amra to reaching their goal. His only regret was that the two pillars of his success were hard to keep in harmony. Amra's drive and competitive spirit often ruffled feathers among other squads, and Iekade frequently found himself making peace. Iekade found his own peace in the many late nights he spent in the library hall, consuming tome after tome of lore. Sometimes Amra joined him, but often the only others sharing the quiet hall with him were vigilant mages who watched him curiously. The librarian even suggested that he would make a good wizard. This surprised Iekade, and he thought briefly about it. Magic did fascinate him, but the study of the arcane arts took years of training just to get started. No, he knew which skills he needed for Arsenoth Delta. Iekade struggled through a wordy book translated from High Elvish into Veshian. The scholar Daranavi was the first to suggest that the Ratmen evolved from rats exposed to the viscera or magic of the fallen titans. This certainly holds true for the diseased, the most numerous of the broods that infect the morning marshes. Broods? There's more than one kind? Daranavi belonged to the cleric order that sought to purge Skarn of Churn's corrupting essence. These elves followed rumors the Titan's grave lay under the marshes that formed in the bloody tidal wave that accompanied Kadam's demise, that it was the Plague Lord's presence that gave rise to the festering pockets that ooze among its swamps and bogs. And Arsenoth's in the middle of all of that? As she and her fellows slogged through the mire, at every abscessed pocket of magic they came across, they encountered rats that walked like men. Daranavi observed them drinking at the foaming pools, bathing in the upwellings of ichor, and penned her conclusion. As Churn had twisted the elves of Termana, so his corpse was shaping this new race. By the time he fell into his bunk, Iekade's mind reeled. The red-fanged, hairy monsters of his nightmares were not one type, but many. The flesh and essence of different titans had twisted each brood in different ways into white wraiths, forge crawlers, foamers, and red witches. Even setting aside the horror of a dozen races of creeping rat warriors, the marshes were also home to monstrous snakes, spiders, and alligators, as well as titan spawn, hags, evil spirits, spider-eye goblins, slime reavers, and mire dwellers. They all sounded horrible. I'll rise to the challenge. Spring gave way to summer, and with it came Divinity's Day. The holiday was purely religious in nature, and everyone was expected to attend temple services. The day was set aside to celebrate the gods' final victory against their parent titans at the end of the Divine War. It was 148 years since the war ended, but many elves, dwarves, and others were old enough to have been alive then and remember. The Vigilants agreed that all the gods, and the titan Denev, deserved their respect and thanks when appropriate. But devotion was reserved for those gods that mirrored the Veshian ways and morals, primarily Madriel and Tanel, and to a lesser degree, Corian, Hadrada, Inkili, and Denev. The dark gods, Chardoon, Belsmith, and Vangal, were thanked and respected, but generally not prayed to. The Vigil Watch Fortress Temple was too small to contain everyone at the fort. Over 200 members of the Baltanian Vigil, about 2/5 of the full force, about 80 recruit trainees, and nearly 100 other miscellaneous members of other vigils. So, once again, the massive courtyard hosted the celebrations. Eochaid's platoon joined the other 2 trainee platoons in his company, standing and watching at the back of the courtyard at dawn. A high stage had been set up in front so that everyone could see. Vigil Marshal Daretha Kaloi made a fine speech, commending both her vigil and the recruits on their achievements over the year. Then the High Priestess of Madriel and the High Priest of Tanel each gave a blessing, and together they led the community in prayer as the sun's first rays crept down the walls toward them. Eochaid wondered a little at the scale of the ceremony and the passion of the crowd. The only priest in his little village followed the dark goddess Belsameth, and while most of the citizens of his village paid respect to her, it was not true devotion. His own family worshipped Madriel. Each Madra Day at dawn, his mother would turn over the secret stone in the garden with the goddess of light's symbol hidden on it, looking carefully around before leading their prayer. Eochaid had known from boyhood that worship was dangerous, but it meant something important to his mother, if not to him. But here, with hundreds of people reciting the words in unison, he felt a great stirring. As the sun's light touched the crowd, people looked up, raising their arms. Eochaid sighed as the light caught him, bathing him in unexpected buoyant warmth. The 2 clerics raised their holy symbols and called out. Stately, shining figures formed behind them, each coalescing into a beautiful woman over 10 feet tall, one unfolding glorious, shimmering wings and the other brandishing a bow. People around Eochaid dropped to their knees, and the rest soon followed, Eochaid among them. The prayer echoed off the fortress walls, and Eochaid raised his own voice. The 2 goddesses shone through tears of joy in his eyes. The prayer ended, and the visions faded into a sparkle of sunlight. Even still, Eochaid felt mighty, like he could take on the whole world just at that moment. After the crowd dispersed, Eochaid and his squad met Hutchling, who'd been with the other clerics chanting on stage. He was taking off his religious vestments. Eochaid looked at him in wonder. "How did they do that?" he gasped. Everyone from the squad gawked as Hutchling only gave a half shrug. "You mean the visage ritual? Yeah, it's perfect for Divinity's Day. Gets everyone inspired." "But," stammered Eochaid, "I feel so blessed? Euphoric? Yeah, that's the point. Have you never felt divine magic before, Lennar?" Eochaid took a deep breath to recenter himself and nodded. "Our village cleric healed me once or twice when I was injured, but it was nothing like that." Hutchling smiled. "I bet it wasn't. A simple cure spell is nothing on a big ritual like that. You should all feel extra special for at least the rest of the day." Jackson Gandy nodded, smiling dizzily. Even Miller looked a little flushed. "You know, we've got an hour before this afternoon's pageant," Hutchling said. "Lennar, let's do something special for you today." The cleric clapped Eochaid on the shoulder. "That bow you keep under your bunk, I bet, would with the power of today's blessing and a little extra magic that you'll be able to shoot it." Eochaid's squad mates roared in agreement and dragged him back to their bunkhouse. Uncertain, but encouraged by their enthusiasm, he gently drew his father's bow from under his bunk. Then Jax grabbed one of his shoulders, Hutchling the other, and they steered him toward the archery range. Amra and her squad also joined the group when they saw them all cross the courtyard. "The spell I'm going to cast only lasts for a few minutes, so get everything ready now," Hutchling said once they arrived. Eochaid struggled to string the bow, but Jax and Gandy stepped up to help him, pushing down together while he looped the bowstring. "Damn, Lennar, how do you normally string this thing?" Gandy asked. Eochaid grunted. "I sort of, sit on it." Amra laughed. "You don't worry about breaking it?" "I don't think it's possible, for me anyway." Gandy held the bow while Eochaid pulled on his archery gloves and bracers. The creak of the leather when he flexed his hands, the familiar pressure of the bracers. He took the bow from her with much greater reverence than when they were stringing it. He glanced around. The rest of their platoon and a handful of vigilants gathered at the range, watching from the sidelines. Eochaid's heart raced, not used to being in the center of so much attention. Holding the bow's grip in his left hand, he stroked the smooth, strong wood of the upper limb with his right, trying to remain calm. "This doesn't feel right," he said, lowering the bow. He tried to step away and backed into Gandy. She peered over his shoulder. "I don't think we damaged it or anything." "You're trying to weasel out of this, Lennar?" Amra asked. "He's not weaseling out of anything," Gandy snarled back. Eochaid glanced between the two women. "No, I mean, it feels wrong using magic. I should earn this." Amra nodded, but Gandy rolled her eyes and sputtered. Jack held up a hand. "Stop, stop," he said, and Gandy clamped her mouth closed on whatever rebellious answer she'd been brewing. Jax put a hand on Eochaid's shoulder and turned him back around to face the targets. In a quiet voice he asked, "Lennar, how big was your father?" In his mind's eye, Eochaid imagined his father holding the bow, standing in the doorway of their house. He waited for the image to melt into blood, into his mother's screams of loss, but the day's rituals calmed him. Instead, his father smiled over his shoulder as he hefted his game bag. He was over 6 feet tall. 6'2", maybe? "And you are?" Eochaid shrugged. Wainwright stepped up and compared her height with his. "He's an inch or so taller than me. 5'7", maybe?" Jax continued. "And how broad was your dad? At the shoulder?" Eochaid pictured his father again filling the doorway. He held his hands up about 3 inches wider than his own shoulders on each side. "So what you're saying is, your father was about as big as Sir Van. Did I read you right?" Eochaid shrugged. "Not as bulky?" "Muscular is the word you're looking for," said Gandy. "Not as muscular then. But yeah, I guess. He was healthy, you know? His white hair made him look older, but he went gray young, I think. He was older than my mother, but not old. And hunting and farming kept him in good shape." "So," continued Jax, "a man about as large, but not quite as bulky as a half-orc warrior, previously owned this bow. And you, a little guy, no offense," Eochaid shrugged, "it's true, you expect to someday use this mighty bow without magic." Even with the benediction of 2 goddesses coursing through him, Eochaid's heart fell. He sighed. Jax squeezed Eochaid's shoulder. He leaned in and whispered in his ear, "Lennar, Eochaid, take the gift. Stop thinking for just this one moment. Enjoy this." His first name echoed inside Eochaid. "I've been Lennar for months," he thought. He looked into Jax's eyes and saw the kindness and concern there, the faith. "I need to do this to honor my father." Eochaid nodded and took an arrow from Gandy. He saw Amra standing next to her, smiling her encouragement. Hutchling said a prayer to Madriel, then touched Eochaid's arm. "Strength like a bull," the wiry priest said, and Eochaid felt the power surge through him. He knocked the arrow and drew the bow, the string creaking as the arrow reached his ear. Grinning like a fool, he released the string. He completely overshot the target. They all cheered. He managed another 10 shots before the spell wore off. He did eventually hit the center of the target. The afternoon and evening were devoted to sharing and hearing stories about the deeds of the gods. There was a pantomime play on the stage where several children of Bride Lake acted out the defeat of Kadum. Eacade found it highly entertaining. He knew the story quite well, being that Belsmith was the center figure of it, but never could have imagined it performed this way. The children clearly took their parts very seriously. No one would dare risk offending a god, but they did overact, especially the young lad in the shaggy goat hide playing Vangal. It was really difficult not to laugh. The boy playing Kadum wore a long brown coat, the back of which was held by a child wearing polished armor. The girl playing Belsmith ripped open Kadum's coat and pulled out a paper heart from inside of it, while the boy playing Chardoon wrapped Kadum in paper chains. The girl lifted the heart over her head and cried out, "I will take this heart and use it as a footstool in my throne room on the moon." Vangal then dragged Kadum to the edge of the stage and pushed him off. Kadum squeaked, and several people dressed in blue caught him as he fell. Then the people in blue pulled a big red blanket over themselves and Kadum. Children dressed in red came out and threw red flower petals into the air and up onto the stage. Vangal looked out at the audience, raised his hands up, and a deep warrior's voice cried, "Oh no! I seem to have turned the sea to blood." He paused, smiled broadly, and made a huge shrug. "Oh well." The three children playing the gods then danced in a circle in celebration just before the entire cast got back up on stage and took their bows. The audience whooped and hollered and gave them a standing ovation. When it was over, Eacade asked, "Who was the character in the shiny armor?" Jax looked shocked. "You don't know about the golem?" He turned to look behind him. Hey, Sir Van! Lennar here doesn't know about the Mithril Golem," he said, pointing dramatically at Eacade. The Shining Knight looked up from his conversation with Lieutenant Shazar. The lieutenant shrugged and waved the paladin along. "You didn't need to interrupt him," mumbled Eacade. "Oh no, if anyone is going to tell you about the Mithril Golem, it has got to be a Mithril Knight." Sir Van wore his full plate mail and carried his helmet, apparently ready for battle at a moment's notice. He carefully sat down on the bench opposite Eacade's squad, watching them, but saying nothing. "Are you all right, sir?" Eacade asked. The half-orc's jaw worked. "Your celebration of Divinity's Day is very informal. This is hardly fit for the champion, for the great Corian, This is hardly fit for the great Corian, the champion. You should spend more of the day in prayer and contemplation." "Sorry, sir," replied Jax, "but you are supposed to be on an exchange. That goes both ways, and this is how we celebrate." Sir Van grunted. Jax continued, "It's our custom to share stories. Might you tell us a tale about Corian? The story of the Mithril Golem." Sir Van sighed and set his helmet on the bench beside him. "All right." He paused for a moment, eyes going distant, and then began. During the war, armies of the divine races fought desperately in every corner of the land. The Lord Corian knew it was beyond even his power to be everywhere at once, and set about making a champion to stand in his place, the Mithril Golem. While it only echoes Corian's righteous presence, it's still a wonder to behold. The golem stands over 100 feet tall and inspires all who gaze upon it. The first time I saw it, it filled my heart with devotion. I knew even then that I wanted to do something worthy in Corian's name. When the evil gods were scheming to fight Kadum, they called on Corian. He was busy forging the blade he would use to cleave the Titan Gulthaga, so we sent the Mithril Golem to assist them in his stead. First, Belsmith bedeviled Kadum with trickery. Before the Earthshaker could discover her ploy and crush her, the Mithril Golem grasped Kadum's tail and set its mighty feet. Kadum flailed and shook with enough power to humble mountains, but the golem was immovable and held fast. Then Kadum wrestled the golem, trying to tear himself away, and crushed its shoulder. But still Corian's champion did not budge, and as they wrestled, Chardoon wrapped Kadum in his magical chains and bound him to a boulder 100 feet high. Belsmith cut out Kadum's heart, and then Vangal hurled his bleeding body into the sea. After the battle, Corian's champion traveled north to the edge of Gelspad to watch from the cliffs, should Kadum rise again. The followers of Corian built a city of Mithril around it, and we needed swords to fight those who'd for the city of Mithril around it, and we needed swords to fight those who'd see the Titans rise again. It gave its own flesh to our forges. He reverently tapped the hilt of his sword. There's a grand temple built around the Mithril Golem where it rests, with great doors ready to open the moment the Golem wakes again to defend the city. The half-orc stopped. The listeners stared as if seeing a shining figure filling the distant sky. "Thank you," said Iacade. "I can see why they wanted you to tell me that." Sir Van nodded, picked up his helmet, and stood. "You're welcome. I understand the need for cultural exchange, but now I must serve my own customs. Please excuse me." He turned and walked toward the temple. Lieutenant Shazar's shoulders sagged as he watched the shining figure leave. Amra approached with a wave of greeting, and Iacade's friends stirred from their reverie of the paladin's story. "What happened? Sir Van seemed sad," said Amra as she sat. "I think he struggles," observed Hutchling. "He was born among the orc warbands of Lead, but he found his place in the Order of the Mithril Knights. And now he's here with, well, we're not a warband, but we're certainly not paladins. I can't imagine it's easy for him." "Hey, he has Lieutenant Shazar to cuddle up with," said Gandy, elbowing Hutchling on the side. "Maybe a little togetherness will help them get the stick out." Amra glared at her. "Don't joke about the man's devotion," she snapped. "Shouldn't half-breeds like you stick together?" Stunned silence overtook the bench. Gandy's face went pale, and Iacade saw the luster of tears in her eyes. Then she rose, turned, and walked away into the crowd. Iacade leapt to his feet and followed. He caught up near the stage. Gandy stood by a pile of discarded props, trying hard to cry without being noticed by the throngs of people. He glanced around quickly. The mountains from the set had been taken down, and behind him was an area where they could be away from the crowd. "Corporal," he said, and gently tugged her toward a quiet spot. She followed. "I don't know why she'd say something like that," Iacade said. "It was horrible, and I'll talk to her about it." "No," Gandy sniffled. "There's no point. I thought here in the Vigil I'd be done with the half-breed remarks, but it's the same everywhere." All Iacade could do was hold her as she cried. Poor Gandy. She's normally so tough. She doesn't like teasing, I guess. There you go. I'm sitting on the floor there. So.
As we'll discover as we go on, Amra has a special talent for getting under people's skin. Okay. Chapter 8. Several weeks later, the squad was assigned its first mission. A train of wagons in need of escort was heading to resupply the Lawharden Vigil, in combat on the northern border of Vesh. Iacade packed quickly for the week's journey and reached the stables before any of his teammates. Mission assignments came only near the end of training. They left the fortress on horseback and met up with the supply wagons. Iacade's horse followed the wagons with little direction, so he watched the underbrush and the trail ahead for signs of ambush. There were none. Terraced fields lay on gentle green hills, and the few forests they rode through were calm and bright. The only people he saw were farmers, waving from their animal pens, barns, and homesteads. Near nightfall, the call to halt echoed from wagon to wagon. The wagoneers pulled into a field in a small border town. Iacade climbed down and helped his friends pitch tents. A young girl from the town brought a pitcher of water and a loaf of bread. She smiled shyly at Iacade's salute and ran back to her cottage. In the end, Iacade fell asleep to the peaceful, distant creak and rush of the town windmill. He dreamt of smoke and woke up to cries of alarm. "Vigilance! To me!" shouted the caravan master. Iacade and his squad tumbled out of their tents and ran towards the wagons. Fire flickered in the grain on the hilltop, creeping down towards the town. "The wagons are safe on the road," the wiry old caravan master called as they approached. "Help us get the horses." Everyone in camp ran towards the paddock. In town, people were shouting. A couple of children were calling, "Mama! Papa!" Iacade stood at the gate, grabbing horses by their bridles and guiding them out to waiting carters to lead away from the flames. As he cleared the last of them, Gandy shouted over the tumult, "My squad, this way!" she called, and jogged down the road, bow held high. As the others fell in behind her, she quickened her pace to a run. "Fire's headed for the mill," she panted. "They need us to protect it if we can." "Fire break," Miller said. "Cut back any brush we can, then beat out any sparks that jump the gap." Gandy nodded. "Go." They pounded up the path through the waving wheat stalks at top speed and reached the mill in under a minute. The windmill's sails fluttered in the smoky air overhead. Eacade hacked furiously at a bramble at its base. "Flames are moving awfully fast," he thought. "How will we protect the sails?" He yanked the last branch loose. "Hutch, can you call down rain or something on the sails?" "My magic isn't that powerful," Hutch answered. "Can you cut them down?" Eacade nodded. Jax, take the other one," he shouted. One on each sail arm, the Vigilants jumped and clambered up the lower sails, cutting the ties that held canvas to wooden frames. Eacade met Jax at the hub, where his friend peered into the smoky distance. "You see something?" Eacade asked. Jax pointed and said, "What in Chardon's hell are those?" Figures capered and scampered in the flames, their red eyes glowing like bright coals even over the light of the blaze. They walked at the head of a wake of fire, grabbing burning branches and lobbing them ahead, waving merrily when new flames erupted. Though the edges of the fire crept toward the mill, the path itself pointed straight to the town. "Gandy!" Eacade yelled as he scrambled back down the wooden arm. Gandy looked up as one of Jax's arrows struck the ground near the receding creatures. "Fuck," she snarled. "Jax, slow them down. The rest of you follow me." They pelted down the curving path back to town. Jax's arrows flickered by in the firelight, pointing to the foe. Eacade couldn't tell if the archer's shots brought down any of them. He drew his two short swords as he ran. "We're not going to make it," shouted Miller. Gandy nodded. "We'll draw them here," she called, skidding to a stop and leaping atop a stone fence. "Hey! Hey, you horse fuckers! Over here! Here!" She waved her arms like a mad woman. Miller and Wainwright hollered their own obscenities while Hutchling banged his spear on his shield. "Gandy!" Eacade called. The corporal glanced at him. Eacade tapped his chest and pointed to the side parallel to the flames. Gandy nodded, grinning, and raised her bow. As Eacade ducked behind a shrub and pulled his cloak up to his eyes, one of Gandy's arrows thrummed by dangerously close. He heard a hoarse cry, and then the roar of fire moving closer as if the wind had changed. Acrid smoke, reeking of scorched flesh, clawed at his nostrils, as of an overripe carcass on a funeral pyre. He choked desperately but stayed silent. A misshapen figure pattered out of the fire. Gandy's arrow exploded through its skull. It fell and rolled downhill. 5 more darted after it. Eacade pounced on the closest one as it passed. He drove his short sword deep into the creature's vitals and wrenched it free of the falling body in a single smooth motion that came naturally after day upon day of practice. Some distant part of Eacade, a cold and collected part, took pleasure in seeing such rewards for that effort. Gandy drew her rapier, but one struck out at her before she could raise it, raking her belly with its claw. Eacade stepped in behind it and sank his other blade into its armpit. Adrenaline coursed through him as the stricken creature fell at his feet. Another beast snarled and snapped at Eacade with grotesque, gnarled fangs, but missed as an arrow, Jax's, caught it in the leg. Eacade whirled and struck out with both swords at the creature's neck, beheading it, and kicked its corpse down onto the ground. He looked around him. Only a few seconds had passed, but all the monsters lay on the ground, still. Miller was on his knees, puking out the stench. Hutchling pressed his hand to Gandy's abdomen as if to heal her. "It's not working," he cried. A fresh wave of odor rose from the greasy blood of the beasts. Wainwright and Gandy coughed furiously. "Move!" gasped Gandy. Hutchling and Wainwright half-dragged, half-carried Gandy down the hill to the path as the rest of the group scrambled with them. They collapsed once they reached clear air. Hutchling raised his hand again and closed his eyes. His hand glowed dimly as he laid it on Gandy's abdomen, and when he lifted it, Gandy was whole. Eacade stood between his friends and the fire as close as he could get, staring into it, bloody weapons ready. Nothing moved but the flames. His whole body still tingled in excitement. "That was all of them!" Jax shouted, running down the hill to meet them. "Holy hounds, Lenore, you wiped out 3 of them!" What were those things? Asked Miller. Char fiends, I think, said Wainwright. I read about them, probably started the fire. They like the smell of burning people. Unholy creatures, said Hutchling. My spells never failed me before. It's as if they drove away her light. Lennar? Someone touched Eocade's shoulder, and he spun around, barely holding his swords in check. Gandhi searched his face. Lennar, you okay? Eocade smiled. Fantastic. He wanted more monsters to kill.
I gave you the short chapters. Give me the short. You had the really big other chapter, though. You did 2 chapters. She's complaining because I gave her the short chapters to read. I like Trouble at Mill, but I get to read the chapter early one. This is chapter 9, which is a short chapter. A short chapter here. We want to get through like the next 2 at least. Whew. Where were we? Right, chapter 9. They delivered the supplies and turned for home. A roadside campsite on their 4th night, Eocade heard familiar voices. He walked between campfires until he found Amr's squad. Lennar, Amr said, smiling up from the campfire. Sir Van made room beside the fire for him to sit. Well met, Amr said. Did you enjoy playing nursemaid to a bunch of carts? I did indeed, Corporal, he said with a grin. What mission they send your squad on? We went to Mullistown and helped kill a pack of gorgons, crowed Amra's squad mate Piper. Eocade paused. Even a low gorgon would eat the lot of us and spit out the buttons, he thought. Really? And what was it like to fight them? The paladin laughed. They didn't, he said. Even I was only there to join the skirmish that drove the beasts into the trap. I shot an arrow at one, Piper said. You thought it was one, Amr countered. We were just there to carry water and run messages for the Mullistown vigil. The other recruits laughed and threw twigs and grass at Piper. Mundane work still makes masters, Sir Van observed. And you all might have died if the pack had climbed the embankment instead of following the stream into the spearmen. May have been a training mission, but the risks were still real. The recruits joined up for the rest of the trip. When they returned to the fortress, a runner from the division captain's office found them in the stables and saluted Amra. Captain wants to see you, ma'am. I'm only just back, she said, collecting her gear and bedroll. I know, ma'am. Told me to fetch you first thing, the runner said. Amra glanced nervously between the young errand boy and her horse and gear. Eocade said, I'll see to all that. I'll bring your stuff to your bunk when I'm done. Thanks, she said. With one more uncertain glance, she turned and followed the runner. Eocade saw both their horses stripped of their tack, fed, and cared for, and then carried his double load of gear to Amra's empty bunkhouse. Her squad, he supposed, had gone to the mess already. He waited. He stowed her pack and unrolled her bedroll on the bunk. He waited some more. Booted feet sounded on the stairs. Amra appeared at the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed. Only when she reached her bunk did she become aware of Eocade. Aronis, she stammered. His whole squad, they're missing. Then the tears began, and Amra Vareth, ranger and vigilant candidate, collapsed on her bunk and wept like a child. Eocade sat down next to her on the bed and held her tightly as she sobbed. Her sorrow broke some barrier inside him, removed the doubts that kept him from touching her, from opening himself to her, from asking the questions in his heart. The tears washed away his concerns. In her choking grief, he heard his own unbearable keening the night after his father died, and he longed to comfort her. Then he remembered. Hey, he whispered. I'm going to tell you a story, one I've never told anyone. Her sobs slowed. He rocked her gently, stroking her hair. When I was a boy, he began, maybe 3 years old, my father went missing. He went out hunting alone and didn't come back home. I was terrified. I didn't sleep at all that first night. They sent out searchers, but he was gone without a trace. I remember my mother saying, Papa's gone, little one. Madriel's taken him away. Even now I remember how it hurt. Mom told me that I cried myself to sleep every night for ages. They searched again and again, but they never found him. Amr sniffled and mumbled into his chest. I thought you said you were a teenager when your father died. I was. He wasn't dead. Not yet, anyway. Because when I was about 7, he came back. Just wandered into the village, looking for a barge to take upriver. He didn't recognize us, any of us. Something had happened to him, some kind of injury. We never found out exactly what. But Mom took him in, convinced him that we were his family. He was odd and distant, but still kind, still fatherly. I was so happy, so deliriously happy. Eventually, he seemed to remember us, but it was fuzzy, inconsistent. But he stayed with my mother, and less than a year later, my brother Cain was born. Amr's breathing steadied. Her grip on him eased, though her head stayed pressed into his cloak. Mom said it was a miracle from Madriel. She set a rule, never hunt alone. Dad grumbled, but eventually all the hunters adopted it. It was harder to sneak up on game with large groups, but we were a lot safer from Titan spawn like ratmen. I loved it when he took me along. Later Cain too, if we were out setting snares and pit traps. How did he die? She asked in a quiet voice. Iacade froze, but took a deep breath and continued. When I was about 14, my father went hunting. We weren't low on meat, and there was a big trip scheduled already in a few days, but he wanted to go right away. There was just no stopping him. Mom insisted that I go as well, though I don't think he wanted me to. She seemed especially worried that day. Maybe they'd had a fight. I never found out. We traveled far into the blood steppes, much farther than usual. We passed up some good game on the way. Dad insisted that there was better further out. He kept reminding me that it was our job to take care of Mom and Cain. We were getting too close to Southfang, the Fire Rack Dragon's hunting grounds, and I got worried. Dad stopped and gave me a hug. Then he told me to wait for him in the foliage and keep cover while he scouted ahead. I thought he'd be back in a minute or so, but it was a long time. Eventually I went out searching, calling his name. Then I found a trail of blood. So much blood, he thought. It led under a den, under some tree roots, he continued, voice trembling. Amr had gone very still in his arms. Inside there was blood everywhere, gnawed bones, still flesh and tatters of clothing on them, he thought. A dire rat den, he continued. One attacked me, bit me, but I managed to get away. I ran and hid and ran some more. Eventually our hunting groups found me. One of them took me back to the village while the others looked for Dad. The hunters came home later that night. They'd fought a group of Slytherin, gotten back Father's pack and bow. I don't remember much more. I got really sick, bad enough that Mom fetched the village cleric to heal me. He blinked. Amr was stroking his hand. Sorry, he said. I was supposed to be comforting you. She shook her head. It's okay. It helped. She was quiet a moment, then looked up at him. You think Ironius could be alive? Iacade sighed. I don't know. Maybe? Amr stood up, leaving Iacade's arms cold and empty. Okay, then. She wiped off her face on her sleeves and straightened her clothing. I have to go. Iacade blinked. Go? Where? She grabbed her rucksack and opened her footlocker. The morning marshes. I have to find Ironius. If he's alive, I have to find him and save him. Before he isn't. Iacade leapt to his feet, grabbing her hand. Wait, you can't just go. Yes, I can. I've finished my training. I've been in combat. I can do this. With no supplies or any preparation, he retorted. Alone? People die alone. Then come with me, she begged, putting her hand on his. You're right that it's dangerous, but I have to do this. You could help me. A pair of vigilants. We're not vigilants, Iacade protested. If we left, it'd be desertion. They'd follow us and... Good, that's what I want, Amr sobbed. I want them to go looking for Ironius. For us, Iacade shouted, to lock us up. We need the vigil's help. It's not as simple as walking out of that gate tonight. Yes, it is, she snarled, and lashed out with her free hand, ripping the other from his grasp. She stormed out of the bunkhouse. Iacade's face stung. He touched his cheek with trembling fingers and felt blood running freely down his chin from the gouges she dug. He closed the lid of Amr's trunk and went to the infirmary. When Iacade saw Amr among the mourning crowd in the mess hall the next day, some of the tension he carried fell away. She looked up at him for a moment, her face empty. Her eyes slid to his cheek. Then, expression never changing, she looked away again. Later that week, Hutchling found him in the library. The young cleric sat down at Eochaid's table without saying anything. Eochaid looked up from his map of the marsh fleets region in the morning marshes. Hutchling opened and closed his mouth. So your girlfriend? She's not my girlfriend, Eochaid interrupted. Your lady friend was thrown out of the captain's office twice this week. Eochaid nodded. Hutchling peered into Eochaid's eyes. Listen, we've all heard about her childhood friend at Arsenoth. Her suffering's obvious, even if... Well... Where are you going with this? Eochaid asked. Hutchling sighed heavily. You know it's a lost cause, yes? You're training for Arsenoth. You know the quality of men they have down there. If they aren't searching for him, it's because he's not out there to rescue. The memory of blood and splintered bone flickered in Eochaid's mind. He nodded again. Hutchling got up from his seat and put an arm around Eochaid, squeezing reassuringly. Then he sighed and let Eochaid go. Just... the only thing worse than one person dying is two. Hutchling stood up and turned to go. Eochaid said, Hutch? The young cleric turned, waiting. What's really on the other side? You know, when you die. Complex emotions crossed Hutchling's features, surprise and others less clear-cut. When they settled, he stared into the distance with a melancholy smile. The gods take us up, he said. They gather our souls to them, based on our lives we lead and who we revere and serve. If you follow Madriel, you live forever in sunlight, free from hardship and turmoil. If you follow Tanel, you run as an animal in perfect autumn forests. If you follow Hadrada, I suppose it's a land where your sums always balance, or something? Eochaid chuckled despite himself. But the point, Hutchling continued, is that you're happy. When your life here ends, if you've served your deity, your soul goes to its perfect home. Do you have to revere them? Hutchling smiled. Depends on the god. I wouldn't laugh at Vangel. Well, you should never laugh at Vangel, but I know Madriel doesn't care if you worshipped her as long as you've done right in the world. Most gods choose our souls based on our actions, not on prayers. But how do we know? Eochaid asked. Hutchling laughed. Look around you, shit for brains. The gods and titans left their boot marks on all our asses. Our Bernice is almost old enough to have seen it, and she has seen Tanel's eternal glade. Eochaid blinked. Hutch smiled and nodded, his eyebrows raised. She died saving King Thane of the dwarves from a shadow elf assassin. He paid to have her raised. Cost almost a king's ransom, though. More if you don't have the body. And not every soul wants to come back. Eochaid nodded. I know you'd never give up on a friend, Hutchling said. But where Aronis is now, I think she'd be better off letting him go. Finally, chapter 10. Fran was not paying attention. See, I got a short chapter that time.
Oh, well. I hope you guys are enjoying this. You've been very quiet in the chat so far. I'm definitely enjoying reading it, so if you are and you want more, just gotta let us know. Chapter 10. More missions followed, though none as exciting as the windmill fire, at least not for Eochaid. They escorted a forsaken elf diplomat from Mullistown to Lave. The elf was convinced dark forces sought to harm him, but the worst that happened was a small bout of dysentery. The command assigned his entire platoon to patrol the southern border of Blood Basin. That should have been exciting, but the most dangerous things Eochaid's squad encountered were blood moths and leeches. Upon their return from Blood Basin, the captain announced the platoon's training was complete. Arberneath roused them before dawn. On the training yard in 5 minutes, she ordered, in clean uniforms. The squad leapt from their bunks, dressed, and rushed to the yard. Arberneath's whole platoon, the 18 remaining recruits who'd endured training and triumphed over it, formed up in ranks by squad and stood at attention. Arberneath returned their salute. To the temple, march! The platoon turned smartly and marched in lines to the fort's temple, where lanterns glowed through the windows. Inside, Captain Wildson sat beside the high priest of Tanel at the front, and off to one side of the dais sat Vigil Marshal Kiloi and the priestess of Madriel. The recruits filed in and sat on the ancient stone benches below. Captain Wildson stood. Today, you swore an oath that'll bind you to the Vigil and to Vesh. Today you commit yourselves. You earn that right through training. He swept the recruits with his powerful gaze. By this oath, you're giving the Vigil your life. After this, your honor is the Vigil's honor, and your shame is the Vigil's shame. It's a great calling and a sacred bond. If you're still uncertain about it, this is the time to walk away. I will respect you for that. A nervous energy filled the silent air. Not a single recruit moved, but all ears listened for the rustle of someone rising, the scrape of footsteps. For a moment, Ikade smelled the wax and old stone of the home commander's sunlit meeting room, the first time he'd heard this same admonition. Yes, I want this life. I can make the world safer. And once I earn my way in the Vigil, I can bring Mom and Cain here, too. A weight eased inside of Ikade, and he sat up straighter. The silence passed. Recruits to your feet, the captain said. The platoon stood. Tanel's priestess rose. Oh, Huntress, be witness to this event. May your watchful eye call out any false oaths spoken this day. The lanterns guttered and danced as a breeze of forest air flowed from the dais through the hall. Vigilance, the captain called. Step forward and take your oaths. One by one, the recruits stepped forward, repeated the oaths, called out, So I swear before the gods, the words like an echo that refused to fade. When the last recruit finished, Madriel's priestess stepped forward. As sunrise dappled the walls of the temple, she opened her arms. The gods hear your oath and witness its truth. May you serve with their blessings. Now you are Vigilance. A few days later, Sergeant Arberneath announced the arrival of Vigil assignments. The squads waited in their bunkhouses as vigil by vigil she called the recruits to her office. Wainwright was the first member of their squad to be assigned. Mullistown, just as I expected. My family comes from a tradition of carters for over 6 generations. When I'm not guarding teamsters, I'll be fixing wagons. Look me up if you ever find yourself traveling the Cordrata corridor. Jax went next. He returned carrying the medallion of Samanye Vigil in Durover. The spies! Exclaimed Gandhi. They're not spies, Jax insisted. The squad applauded, and Iakade clapped his friend on the back. Jax laughed. You would have been great in Samanye, he said. You're subtle and quiet and trained in infiltration. Excellent qualities for a spy, if that is what we are. But you had to want the Marsh Vigil. You might be right, replied Iakade, but I worked hard for this, and I haven't been chosen yet. They chatted nervously, the remaining recruits awaiting the call. Next was Miller, assigned to the Hornswythe Vigil. It's too close to Hadrad for my liking. It's at least 200 miles from Hadrad, insisted Hutchling. Yeah, like I said, too close. But apparently we overlap with Arsenos, so I might get to work with Lennar again. Iakade sighed. It's not a done deal, but that would be nice. Gandhi was assigned to the Ganges Vigil. Typical, she griped. Just because I'm half-elf. As soon as my first year is up, I am moving. You could join Lennar and Arsenath, said Miller. Not that exciting. I haven't been... Yeah, we know, said Gandhi. The others passed around the amber medallions that identified their vigil and granted them enchantments useful in the regions where they would operate. Iakade turned over Wainwright's amber chunk of adamantite, watching it glitter. He studied Gandhi's flower petal and Jax's chunk with a saw-toothed blade of grass inside. And through it all, Iakade fidgeted. How is Hutch so damn composed? The cleric sat on his bunk, smiling and joking as if waiting only for the dinner bell to sound. Then it was finally Iakade's turn. He nearly ran to meet with Sergeant Arberneath. Amra was already there when he arrived, eyes straight ahead and posture stiff. Arbenith stood behind her desk, and a tousled, roguish, well-traveled man in his late 20s wearing Vigil colors leaned in a corner of the office. Eacade saluted. Arbenith waved him into the room. "Say hello to Captain Skywarder, recruits." "Hello, sir," they both snapped. Arbenith smiled. The smile faded. "So, you two really want to muck about in the swamp, do you?" she asked. Eacade lit up. "Yes, ma'am," replied Amra stiffly. Arbenith glanced skeptically at the other Vigilant. Skywarder pursed his lips, then nodded. "It's not often that Arsenoth Delta takes on raw recruits. It's like learning to swim by drowning, but I haven't heard of any as determined to get in as you two in a long time. And stubbornness is definitely a benefit in the morning marshes." Arbenith opened a box and pulled out 2 Vigil medallions. At the center of each was a piece of amber with a tiny insect trapped inside, a caterpillar. As she put the 2 medallions around their necks, she saluted. "Congratulations, Vigilance." "Meet me at the stables tomorrow after breakfast," the blond man said. "We'll ride out to River Rock by noon. Dismissed." Eacade gripped his new medallion fiercely in his hand. Amra saw the grin in his face and returned a brief smile of her own as she turned for her barracks. His friends cheered as he entered the room. "Arsenoth! Arsenoth! Arsenoth!" Eacade raised his hand in triumph. They formed a circle around him, waving their medallions, all talking at once about the adventures they would have. "What does your medallion do again, Lennar?" Miller asked. "Helps me hide and lets me walk on water twice a day," he laughed. Hutchling sat quietly on his bunk, smiling and laughing with them, but not dancing. "She's taking forever to call you, Hutch," Gandy noted. "Oh, I already spoke to the sergeant." "And?" "I can't decide." Silence fell like a cloak. Hutchling shrugged. "I'm a cleric, and a good one, apparently. I pretty much have my pick of vigils. Clerics are wanted everywhere, and since Lennar here taught me how to climb a tree, none of them are worried about me keeping up." The room erupted again, 4 voices arguing over each other about the benefits of Hornswythe, over Ganges, over Mullistown, over Simanye. Eacade thought of the bloody swamp of the Delta, imagined gentle Hutchling waist-deep in mud and gore, and stayed silent. "Stop, stop," Hutchling cried. "It's great that you all love me. I am deeply flattered." Jack smirked and shook his head. "No, we just need a good cleric." Hutchling rolled his eyes at Jax and then paused. I think I'm staying in Beltanian." "You're going to become a teacher?" asked Gandy. "No," laughed Hutchling. "Have you looked around here? Beltanian Vigil is over 500 strong, but less than half of that is here at Bride Lake. Only the trainers are here full-time. No other Vigil travels quite like Beltanian. They go on all these special missions. Everyone else patrols specific regions on the Veshan border, but Beltanians, that's the Vigil that travels the world for the Home Commander. They've even gone as far as Termana, a whole other continent. If you really want to see the world, that's the one to join." The dancing and conversation resumed. Miller produced a small bottle of surprisingly strong liquor, and Hutchling improvised a complicated jig with Gandy in the center of the room. Echoes from the courtyard told Eacade that his squad was not alone in its revels. Wainwright took Eacade aside. "We could have been together, if you hadn't spent your whole time pining after Vareth, but you've lost your chance with me." "Pining after? Wait, are you?" Eacade stared. She studied his face and smiled a half-smile. "Good luck with her," she continued soberly. "Maybe after she's done mourning, you two will work it out." Something shook his shoulder, jolting Eacade awake. His hand struck out, closing around a wrist. He turned to the intruder. Amra, a full rucksack on her back, swords on her hips, and bedroll hanging from her shoulder, smirked down at him in the moonlight. He relaxed his grip, and she pulled her hand free. "Pack your things if you're coming with me," she hissed. Eacade looked around the dark room. His squad mates slept. There were no sounds from the courtyard. He shook his head in confusion. Amra looked down imperiously. We have our medallions now, like you wanted, so let's go. Iakade looked up into her eyes. Amra radiated an icy determination, tight-lipped, hands on her hips. Iakade chewed his lips, then nodded. He slipped out of bed and put on his pants and boots. He quietly shoveled the rest of his gear from his trunk into his pack, while Amra held it open for him. His new medallion banged against his bare chest. The bow gleamed in its place under the bunk. Once we leave here, we're never coming back. He lifted it to his shoulder. Lennar, what are you doing? Hutchling whispered from the next bunk. Iakade looked up at him, his finger to his lips. Hutchling's gaze shifted, focusing on Amra, and he nodded. Sitting up, he gestured to Iakade, who walked over and crouched down next to him. Amra continued shoveling things into Iakade's pack. Following your heart, Hutchling whispered to him. Iakade looked at Amra, then back at Hutchling, and shrugged. We're going to the morning marshes to find Aranis. Hutchling's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed in understanding. You're an idiot, you know that, right? He muttered. He pulled Iakade close and whispered in his ear. I couldn't decide because I was seriously considering Arsenath. Iakade heard his voice catch, and Hutchling glanced at Amra. Then he locked his gaze on Iakade. Don't get hurt. I won't be there to heal you. Hutchling gripped Iakade in his arms and held tight. Iakade put his own arms around the wiry cleric. He squeezed back, gently patting the tense shoulders. I'll be careful. After a moment, Hutchling pushed him away and barely whispered, I'll miss you. Now get out of here before I decide to tell someone, Hutchling finished, eyes shining, and turned over in his bunk, shrugging up under his blanket. Iakade took his pack and weapons from Amra, and they crossed to the door like ghosts. He turned back once, taking in his sleeping friends, then shouldered his load and left. Or you can do that. That's fine too.
So that's as far as we hope to read. At least get that far, because that's sort of the end of part 1 of 3 parts. But we can go a little further, because we were supposed to also fill a 2-hour time slot. Now, what time did we start? It was like 7? I think it was 7 our time. So I'm going to at least get through the next chapter, which I call Fran's chapter, because this was the first chapter that every chapter, like, either I took the lead and Fran edited, or Fran took the lead and I edited. And sometimes it was like scene, or sometimes we just sort of did it together. This was the first chapter that Fran wrote, and then I tweaked it, but like out of the book so far, I was kind of the lead on it until chapter 11. Because it's, well, you'll see, I guess. Chapter 11. They rode their horses hard, as far as the southern border. The stink of the marshes carried far inland, a tang of copper and rot, faint but insistent. By the time they reached the last watchtower on the road, the air felt heavy with it. Soldiers patrolled the walls of the outpost, but the guard greeted them cheerfully enough. They took their horses to the stables. The woman in charge nodded and gestured them in as soon as she saw their medallions. "Heading to the marshes?" she asked. Iakade looked to Amra, but she paid no attention, grabbing her gear from the saddlebags and looking toward the gate. Iakade nodded to the stable hand, and she helped him collect his own pack. "Horses just slow you down rest of the way," the woman said. "We'll take him back north with the next troop turnover." Grasslands gradually gave way to bogs as they traveled. The ground sloped downward, wetter and wetter, until each step sucked at their boots. Tiny insects swarmed over stagnant water. The late summer air permeated their clothes, and no breeze stirred the head-high grass to relieve them. The sun soaked the metal and leather of Iakade's armor, but he dared not remove it. Iakade and Amra studied the map he'd copied from the scrolls kept in Bride Lake, hunting a route that avoided known Slytherin enclaves. The parchment had gotten damp, and it was growing difficult to read. Wish we'd taken the time to learn some magic. There's spells that would make all this more bearable, he grumbled. Amra scanned the horizon. We're stalkers. If you wanted to channel divine magic and train a rabbit to carry your backpack, you should have taken a different path. Eokade snorted. Me? Training a pet? I can hardly ride a horse. I can't imagine having a badger or something following me around. Amra cracked a brief smile, but then resumed the hunt for the next dry path. At least I got her to smile, Eokade thought. The Lahardan Vigil keeps wolves, he continued, slogging after her through the tall, wet grass. I didn't read anything about Arsenoth Delta training animals. Do you think they have them? Doubt it, she replied, then paused, probing the silt with her pole. But if they did, it would have to be giant frogs. That's the only thing that could survive out here. Or birds, Eokade countered. Sure, birds. Bet Marshal Silverblade has a great big crow or something. The thickening mud and unpredictable channels of water quickly absorbed their attention and smothered their conversation. Over the course of the day, they nearly ran afoul of several nasty creatures. Once they ducked into a thicket of ferns just in time to see a pair of dog-sized spiders hauling a garfish as large as Amra out of the water on thick web lines. Another time, 2 spined lizards wrestled in the channel they were about to cross before snapping and snarling their way off into the reeds. The third time, they heard something enormous slithering along through the scrub, but only saw the 10-foot-wide trail of crushed foliage and broken branches it left behind. They continued through the marsh until late afternoon. Trees clawed their way out of the grasses, short and stunted at first, then tall and tangled, covered in other plant life. Vines and ferns festooned the branches, choking the limbs. The deep shadows and dappled light made it difficult to tell fauna from foliage. They learned to step carefully after Eokade nearly lost a leg to something gnarled with pincers. When the sun was low on the horizon, they looked for a place to camp. Amra pointed out a large dead tree with low enough branches to climb. It might have been an oak tree long ago, but now only a trunk and branches covered by an overgrown of grasses, moss, and leafy plants. They clambered up, disturbing a nest of small vipers that had made their home in the crotch of a large limb. They pulled trailing vines around them to hide behind, then ate cold rations and huddled close together under their cloaks. Amra took first watch while Eokade curled up back against the tree trunk. He slept lightly and woke in darkness to the sound of something moving below. The night was blindingly black, the air heavy with rain that refused to fall. He closed one fist around the hilt of his sword and reached out the other where Amra would be. Her hand clasped his. Something large lumbered past, scraping against the trunk of the tree so the branches rustled. They held still and didn't relax again until it was long gone. Eokade took his own watch. As Amra slept, he listened to unfamiliar animal cries, thrumming barks, and choruses. He counted the stars that peeked between the leaves. He felt he should pray, but had no idea what to say or to whom. In the morning, they pored over the map again. It would be somewhere near here, Amra said, tapping on the map just east of the words Marsh Fleet. The Marsh Fleet was a region in the marsh filled with the wreckage of lost ships. Former Slytherin were known to build nests aboard the vessels. It was over 100 miles from the Blood Sea, and yet new ships regularly appeared there. Magic, Eokade figured. Before they went missing, Aronis's squad had been scouting one such new addition to the fleet. They ate, bundled up their gear, and made their way down to the mist-covered ground. They traveled for several hours, keeping to the underbrush and moving slowly through the haze. The marsh was full of drowned villages, whose leaning skeletal remains sometimes jutted out of the muck and cattails, but such places attracted the more intelligent and predatory creatures of the marsh. Amra grabbed his arm. Listen. A rattle echoed through the mist, like a bundle of quill pens being shaken. Another rattle from another direction, then a series of them. Memory stirred Eokade to action almost before he knew what he recalled. He grabbed Amra and ran toward a nearby darkness in the mist, which resolved into a half-sunken wall. They threw themselves down in the mud and ferns. 2 shadows skimmed by silently above their heads. Eokade looked up as a third swooped in and landed. A man-sized reptile with leathery wings and cruel talons croaked once, then scuttled up the mass of masonry and leapt into the air, quiet as a breath. More shadows passed. They waited. Nothing further. "Mire dwellers," Eacade whispered. "We should go." They fled the ruins, glad their luck had held. By mid-afternoon, the shadows of hulls and masts were visible through the mist, and they could hear the creak of yard arms and the flapping of sailcloth. Yet, Eacade realized, there was no breeze. The air was still and stagnant. Amr pointed ahead, eyes burning with almost fevered determination. They stalked between the wrecks, skirting close to their wooden hulls. Faint voices halted them. Eacade found the remains of a rowboat fallen from its rotted davit long ago. The two of them scrambled under it. 4 Slytherin slunk out of the mist, burly, black, and shaggy. They all wore jewelry or had rings and shiny trinkets tied into their matted fur. They muttered to one another through yellowed teeth. Though his heart hammered as if it might escape his chest, Eacade's mind felt calm. He gripped the handles of his blades and gauged the distance to them. Amr locked his fingers around his shoulder as he leaned forward to pounce. She shook her head. He gritted his teeth. They walked past. "Turn around, you vermin," he thought. "Turn around. Let me see you. I've come all this way, and this time I'm ready." He squeezed the hilt of his sword so tightly he could feel the bands of their leather wrapping through his thick gloves. In his mind, he could feel the growl of steel sliding between ribs, the warmth of blood soaking through cloth, the resistance of flesh and metal as he yanked the blade free and whirled around to strike again. They waited for several more minutes. His ardor cooled. His grip on his sword hilts loosened. The ratman did not return. Amr whacked him on the back of the head. "You almost got us killed," she hissed at him. "She's right. That was stupid." "Sorry," he whispered. "It won't happen again." She shook her head. You had the right idea. Just not when we're outnumbered. We need to know how many there are before we risk engaging." They shared a grim nod, then continued their search. As the day progressed, the mist only closed in more tightly. When it hid them, it also covered everything else. "I don't think we're going to find anything until this burns off," Eacade hissed. Amr waved him away in annoyance. A short while later, she froze and then rushed forward. A ship's prow stuck out of a soil bank as if riding an earthen wave. She scrambled through the mud and grassy hummocks to reach it, and he followed her. Stuck in the softening wood, about head height, was an arrow. She reached up and yanked it free. She looked at him with a grim smile, her eyes shining. They were here. He took the arrow and studied it. The broad arrowhead was Veshian steel, barbed for hunting. From the vigils, Fletcher's for sure. He nodded. She continued forward, combing the ground for tracks in the dimming light. He followed, but the clinging mist was so thick he could barely see his muddy feet. "I don't see anything," he whispered. "Even Arborneath couldn't track someone through this." Amr said nothing. She turned to the grounded ship and circled out again. Eacade paced after her for fear of losing her in the gray. She cursed under her breath and returned to the ship again, pacing like a caged cat. "The light's fading. We should find shelter and wait this out," he suggested. "No, I'm done waiting." "The mist will clear," Eacade said. "When?" she snarled, eyes blazing. "Coward!" He stepped back. As Amr seethed, he pricked up his ears, listening for any movement in response to her outburst. Nothing stirred in the deepening dark. "The rat men," he murmured, "can see in the dark. They can hear better than us. Who knows? Maybe they can smell where we've been. To win the fight, we have to plan ahead. You said that." Her jaw worked. "Till the mist clears," she growled. "No longer." Eacade led as they picked their way clear of the mud-locked fleet. Eacade woke to the sound of rain and a sense of absence. He glanced around their damp nest in the thicket of bushes, but Amr was gone. He grabbed his pack and crawled out into the mire. The haze was gone. Though little light reached him through the thick clouds, he could still see well enough to follow Amr's boot prints, and he knew where she would go, straight as an arrow back to the old ship sinking into the marsh. The rain spattered, then poured, then roared. Water cut channels in the mud, and the clump of grass became islands. Eacade reached the ship. Amr had cut an X in the soft wood. He circled out until he found a broken patch of reeds and picked up a trail of scrambling boot prints. Thunder underscored the sound of the rain. Iakade traveled as fast as he could, eyes locked on the ground, losing the track and finding it again, going further and further into the muck. The water rose until he could no longer see footprints, and could only peer through the downpour for broken vegetation. He splashed from hummock to hummock, tracing Amra's course in the broken reeds and cattails. The trail went cold. He struck out in the straightest line he could, but faltered as a raging torrent that rushed down a channel in the grass. He turned back to the last mound of broken reeds he'd found and stuck his staff in the mud to mark the spot. He pressed on again at an angle to his previous path, only to sink to his chest through a floating island of peat and have to claw his way out. Again and again he returned to his staff, picking a direction and searching for more signs. Each time he found nothing. Panting, he leaned on his staff. The water continued to rise. In desperation, he sought out the highest tree-covered hillock, still above the waterline. He yanked the staff free and plunged toward it through the flood. When the ground went out from under him, he kicked ahead, driving the pole into the mud beneath, fighting through the next clump of brush. He heaved himself past and pushed on. Halfway to the hill, he heard the groan of wood and the whoosh of something huge sliding through the rushes. Iakade glanced up just in time to see the hulk of a ship, mast snapped but afloat, coursing down the channel toward him. He took 3 strokes toward the channel's edge before the wedge of wood was on him, grinding him under, pushing him into the silt, tearing and tumbling him. The weight dove the air out of his lungs. Then it was gone, carried away by the current, and Iakade was in utter darkness. His eyes burned, his lungs burned. He had no sense of direction. Shit. He swept his arms out through the invisible morass, feeling nothing solid, no up, no down. He reached for his neck, found the chain of his vigil medallion, and followed it with his fingers to the amber pendant. What was the word to activate it? He gripped the little nugget tightly and shouted the charm as loud as he could, the words burbling through the water and silt. The muck seemed to jet around him, tearing his hand from the medallion, nearly ripping off his pack and boots. Then he was in the air, the roar of the rain in his clearing ears, floating a hair's breadth above the water. He coughed up globs of viscid, watery ooze. Rain sluiced the grime out of his eyes. He blinked the last of the grit away and sought out the copse of trees. Then he struggled to his knees, rose to his feet, and stumbled toward them, floating like a bedraggled ghost on the surface of the torrent. He pulled himself up through the grass into the trees, fell against a gnarled trunk, and howled, the sound tearing from his raw throat and echoing in the rain. Then he curled into his sodden cloak and closed his eyes. Gray light filtered through the branches. Slow rain dripped, pooling on his cloak. He lay huddled on his side. A marsh bird called. Something splashed and thrashed in the water. Iakade lay still. Another splash. Somewhere else. Iakade raised his head. A quiet rustle in the grass. He peered around the tree. A black, scraggly form crept through the grass. It reached the edge of the channel and peered out, a crude spear in its long-fingered hand. A Slytherin. It lanced the water and then pulled back, a wriggling fish. Chuckling to itself, it slipped the fish in a bag and moved up the stream. Iakade picked up a fist-sized rock. He wrapped his mud-caked cloak around him and crawled out of the back of the thicket and down the mound. Then he reached the water. He touched his amulet and murmured the charm. He felt his feet rose from the mud. His footfalls made no sound as he slipped across the channel and into the grass. He scanned his surroundings. The creature was alone. It was smaller than the ones he'd seen patrolling between the ships. Iakade crept quickly along the stream, closing on his prey by sound, moving when it moved. Another splash, murmured chittering, quiet footfalls. Iakade stepped from behind the last clump of cattails. The creature's back was to him. He brought down the rock. The rat man pitched over into the mud. Its spear floated, caught the current, and drifted away. Iakade dragged the unconscious Slytherin by the leg. At the water, the creature's head went under. The dragging was easier, though, without the mud and reeds to pull against. The Slytherin coughed and sputtered, but he could not muster the strength to shake loose. Iakade hauled it up the slope and into the trees. It keened eerily as he tied its hands to a branch. He knelt in front of it. Its eyes struggled to focus. Blood dripped from one large ear. This one had few adornments in its fur, just a silver bracelet knotted at its shoulder. "There was a woman here last night. Did you see her?" The black eyes looked back at him. It moaned again. "Me," he barked, thumping his own chest. "People like me have been here. Where are they now?" The creature flinched. It chittered and squealed and flapped its ears. It pulled at the rope around its hands, fingers clutching the air. "You speak Lydian," he said in the trader's tongue. "Shalzari, Calastian, any human tongue." The creature chittered and squirmed away, pushing back against the tree. Eacade sighed and dropped his hands to his sides. The Slytherin looked up at him. In a single movement, Eacade drew his sword out of its scabbard and cut the creature's throat. He's a little upset. We are almost at 9. It's 8:57, so, yeah. Should we end on such a rough little cliffhanger there?
No, I'm not hearing anything from the...
Yeah, I don't know what we're supposed to do next.
We don't actually have any information on who's supposed to follow.
If anyone, we may be done for the night, I think, and I think Trick is going to pick this up tomorrow, continuing this fundraiser a little bit longer. But I know we weren't going to go 24/7 on this. So we're at 170, so there was at least one donation while we read our little bit from Vigilant. So I hope everybody who stuck around enjoyed it. And we might be putting this... I might try to edit this down and throw it on YouTube or something, I don't know. And maybe do some more reading. Someday I want to finish reading this book out loud to folks who prefer hearing ebooks over actually reading a book. Okay, so I again hope y'all enjoyed it, and if you want to read more, it's available on Drive-Thru or Fiction. The link is below me, and it's available also on Barnes & Noble and on Amazon. So the ebook is available on 3, and print on demand is available on Drive-Thru. So check it out. That was not even a third of the book. Part 1 is... I said it was part 1, but part 1 is like much smaller than parts 2 and 3. So hope you liked it. And we are working on the sequel, just very, very slowly. Thank you, everybody. And you want to wave goodbye, love? I guess not. She's wandered off. So see you. You're from there. Okay. See you all next time, I guess. Bye.